50 metropolitan areas in the country, and this pattern is quite unusual in that the highest accessibility is quite distant from the central core. Well, I'm interested in seeing which populations are reaping the benefits of this accessibility. So I can plot this. This is a little bit hard to get your brain around this. This is a three-dimensional depiction then of the three-county region. So the colors are still showing accessibility. The dark colors are good access to jobs. The Y elevation, the bars that are sticking up into space, are showing just the white population now, all right? If you look closely, you can see virtually a wall here. Oops. Virtually a wall here. Where there's very little white population. But what this tells us is that white people in the region experience both good and bad accessibility. They're kind of spread generally throughout the region. By contrast, African American population, of course, is quite spatially concentrated, a bit distant from the best accessibility, but nonetheless not all that bad either. Right? It's not the worst accessibility. We can plot it and compare then how whites and blacks are doing relative to one another on this. And so what this chart is showing, so the dark line is showing African Americans, the gray line is showing white, and what it says is that the white population, like I said before, experiences accessibility across the spectrum. About half of whites experience poor accessibility and about half of whites experience good accessibility. That's sort of consistent with what we understand of white residential locations. White people can live just about anywhere they want to in the metropolitan region, as opposed to African Americans who face much greater constraints in where they can live. And so by contrast, we see that African Americans are either really bad or actually quite good. And the good is suggesting that to be centrally located is important when we measure accessibility. So there's something important about being at the core of a metropolitan region. So being centrally located means that you're closer to a wider range of things than if you are in the suburbs. And that's a good thing for revitalizing the core of our region. It suggests that it's important to be centrally located. But this is very troubling, that about 20% of African Americans are off the charts bad. And it's because of two things: poor public transit and a very disproportionate availability of cars among African Americans. So about 1 in 3 African American households in Detroit don't have a car in a metropolis that was built for cars. You can also measure, you can plot out on this what I might just call vulnerable populations. We could think about people who are poor without cars. In this case, a very specific population: women-headed households with children, living in poverty, and without a car. That's a pretty precarious position to be in. And you can see from these bubbles that, again, they don't live where job access is best. And many of them are living beyond the reach of the central city transit system. So that seems to be a pretty vulnerable place to be. Now I've been talking about getting to jobs. But of course, another aspect of our lives is getting to grocery stores and restaurants and parks and all of these other things that enrich our lives. So this is non-work. And what I'm finding is that comparing by race, by Latino status, by poverty status, etc., there are some destinations for which we see very little disadvantage among vulnerable populations. So for example, this one here is showing convenience stores. Other examples of little disadvantage are things like child care centers. Now, child care centers and convenience stores are very much correlated with density. They're sort of located based on the density of population. By contrast, now restaurants are a little bit of each. I should explain here. green is good accessibility, red is bad accessibility. So I've changed my color scheme on you here, but that's what's going on here. So, of course, lots of restaurants right downtown, but a lot of it is starting to spread out now beyond the central city. What's really quite stunning is the next slide. So this is grocery stores, all right? And you probably know that grocery closings have hit Detroit very, very hard. So it's hard to get good, fresh food at reasonable prices within the central city of Detroit. And that's what this is showing. This red is almost covering all of the central city. And the green is quite distant all the way around. So here's an example then of retail, along with grocery stores, is also retail trade. Is showing a big disadvantage in people's ability to engage with opportunities. I'll skip that. This is just showing the various municipalities based on their ability to get to various places, grocery stores, convenience stores, banks, child care centers, etc. And what you sort of expect is kind of like this, where it's sort of green to yellow to red. So green is good, red is bad in this case. And so you look for things that deviate from that pattern. And of course, grocery stores is very red up here where we would expect it to be green. Anyway, that's a little more complicated, I won't get into, but let me just then wrap up. So by using our traditional measures of mobility, the Detroit region actually comes out looking pretty good. We get to drive a lot. But when we think of it in terms of what we actually get for the driving that we do, we have some serious disadvantages. There's a disadvantage to using a mobility-based view in social justice for a couple of reasons. One is that the mobility-based approach focuses on transportation infrastructure alone. That is, how well you can move from A to B on a particular transportation link. And we are deceived into thinking that everybody experiences it equally because rich cars and poor cars travel at the same speed down the road. And so we're deceived into thinking in the mobility world that everything is equal. But when we add into the mix what we're actually getting for the traveling that we're doing on accessibility, we see then that there are actually very big disparities because what comes into the picture is where you live, whether you have alternatives to driving, and whether you have the availability of a car. Now, there's another reason why social justice is important for why the mobility view does not work well for social justice is, let's see. Well, let me just hold off on that. Let me hold off on that and just wrap up and say that thinking of it in this different way, what the Detroit region is lacking is good transit and ability to get to cars. All right. So without those things, we have built our metropolis on the assumption that people can drive, and that's holding a lot of people back. Okay, I'll just leave it there. Yeah, question.
I don't understand your third conclusion, especially when you take into consideration the probability that we're going to be facing a peak oil situation in the very near future, where the cost of gas is going to be extremely high.
Yeah. So my third conclusion here is that I'm making the provocative claim that we need to get cars into the hands of poor people. And I always get quite strong reactions to that because, let's face it, most of our transportation policy these days is trying very hard to get people out of their cars for good reasons. Environmental degradation, congestion on the roads, cars are costly, etc. This is coming from my understanding of the economic conditions of the day, that poverty is such an urgent problem that we don't have the luxury of waiting to build alternatives, transit systems, that will take 25 years or more before we actually provide reasonable alternatives. And in the meantime, I think we need to